Hi, I'm Jasper Becker. I'm a writer and author, and I've been following China since the mid 1980s. And I've written about 10 books on China and its neighboring countries. So, this channel is looking at where China is going, and in particular at its economic problems. So, in today's broadcast, we're going to take a look at the background of why China started pumping up its economy in the first place. And the best way of looking at this is not to look so much at China's domestic policies, important though these are, and the various power struggles between its political factions at the top of the Communist Party, and to see things through the prism of two major economic boom and bust cycles, which forced China to change the direction of its economic policy. As you know, China is run by a communist party. It favors 5-year economic plans. Everything possible is planned and organized as much as is humanly possible. The government prides itself on its ability to control the economy, but in reality, it's been strongly influenced by what's been happening around China. So we have two major economic crises which we are interested in. The first one was the Asian financial crisis of 1990, which started in 1998 and was really in East Asia. And this was started in Thailand and then eventually spread all over Southeast Asia and almost all of East Asia. At the time, China was in the midst of its own economic reforms, which were mostly about closing down loss making state enterprises and liberalizing price and wage controls in the economy. And these were undoubtedly very important. But what's the lessons that China learned from the Asian financial crisis were extremely important. So there were a lot of dramatic political changes in these East Asian countries. Governments fell, leaders who had been there for a long time had to step down. There were public protests, pro-democracy movements. So that was one thing that the Chinese leadership was extremely worried about. The second was there was enormous capital flight. The third problem was that the countries had encouraged easy lending, not through their own volition, but because they had attempted to stabilize their economies by pegging their currencies to the US dollar. And when the US banking authorities began loosening credit, these Asian economies also experienced this loosening of monetary control. So there was enormous overinvestment into property. A lot of factories were built. A lot of other kinds of malinvestment took place. And the only way that these countries could escape from their debts and from this political and economic crisis was by borrowing money from abroad and putting themselves under the control of the International Monetary Fund. So obviously they'd lost a lot of their sovereignty. And so when China looked at what happened to these neighboring countries, it became quite alarmed. So some of the lessons which it drew from this experience led to the current economic problems that we're seeing in China today. So, one of the things it concluded was it didn't want to see any popular unrest. It didn't want to put itself under the control of the International Monetary Fund. It didn't want to rely too much on foreign investors. And it felt that the greatest insurance policy that it could have was to turn to an export led economy and therefore to build up huge foreign currency reserves. And that's pretty much exactly what China did. And it did it extremely successfully. Obviously, it did require a great deal of foreign investment, but this foreign investment was directed mainly at export industries. So it wasn't so much about opening up its domestic market to foreign investors, although that did happen in many sectors. It wasn't about providing better schools or housing or health services for its own citizens. It embarked on an enormous expansion of exports, and it was very successful at building up enormous foreign currency reserves. I think at one point they were 3 trillion or 4 trillion US dollars. It bought enormous amounts of US government debt, Japanese debt, and it created employment for tens of millions of migrant workers who lived in dormitories and moved to the cities to work on building projects and in these huge factories which were built. And it began this wave of exports, which have not really subsided even today. China is still increasing its exports. And so the other lesson that China took from the Asia financial crisis was that it had to pay a great deal of attention of how exactly it linked its currency to the US dollar. So the problems with the Thai baht or the Indonesian ringgit or the South Korean won and these other currencies is that they took on a lot of debt denominated in US dollars or other foreign currencies. And when the collapse happened in 1997, 1998, these currencies fell in value by 50 or 60%. So lots of people then lost their jobs, but the wages fell in Southeast Asia. And so, in order for China to compete with Southeast Asia in many of these industries, it also had to initially bring down the value of the renminbi to make its labor intensive factories competitive. And it had to import a great deal of new manufacturing equipment, which it did from Germany and other European countries. So there was a tremendous increase in machinery imports, and there was a desire to avoid taking on government debt denominated in a foreign currency in case there'd be a similar collapse. So that meant that a lot of the profits from these export industries were not recycled into the economy. They remained in the control of the state, and people who saved their money were given extremely low interest rates. So they did not stimulate domestic demand very much. And most of the people in China remained quite poor, actually, even though they had employment. So the problem was that eventually these export industries encouraged the government to think that the returns it was getting, the reserves that were building it up, would protect it against another boom and bust cycle. And that made the Chinese government extremely self confident and ambitious. And it began to try and recycle these surpluses into more and more crazy infrastructure projects. And China began to engage in a huge investment in dams, in railways, in ports and harbors, in airports, and so on. And this did not actually stimulate domestic demand and led to enormous distortions in the economy. And in the next video, I'm going to talk in more detail about how these distortions played out in the 2008 economic crisis and how that led to the problems that we're seeing today. Thank you. So if you enjoyed listening to this video and want to read some of my books about the history of China and Korea and Mongolia and other aspects of Asian history, you can find a list of my books on a link below. And you can also find details of my website and order books on Amazon or from my own website. Thank you.